Well, everyone, thank you for coming tonight. Glad to see so many people here. This is the second session of Anodos. Hopefully you all pulled something out of the first session. I talked to quite a few of you after the last session, and there were a couple of recurring questions. I'm going to start with just a brief recap of what we talked about last time, and then we'll get into answering. There was one or two questions that I heard from a couple different people, which I'll try and answer. So the recap from last time, if you remember, everyone lives in a story. Everyone has a worldview, and each of our worldviews contain different lenses. So some of these lenses are from our life experiences, they're from our loved ones, they're from the institutions we were part of. These lenses are from particular experiences that we had. And some of these lenses are clarifying and beautiful, but some of these lenses are blinding. They prevent us from seeing the world as it truly is. They sort of twist reality. And then some of the lenses, we really had no say at all. We just sort of adopted those lenses. So modernity, just the society that we live in, has given us some particularly toxic lenses, which really throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of a lot of philosophical and Christian truisms. Postmodernism, sort of the way it's structured, ends in some pretty inevitable spots. So again, postmodernism is sort of a conglomeration of a whole bunch of different philosophies: universalism, dualism, relativism, materialism, nominalism, individualism. And we went through the burdensome process of trying to understand those complicated terms last time. But postmodernism, if you accumulate all these together, basically it ends in sort of this chaotic, relativistic, nihilistic mindset where nothing matters, everything's the same, everything has the same value. There is no good, no bad, no right, no wrong, no true or false. It's all subjective. It's all your personal preference. It's not the truth, it's my truth and your truth. And so what we're hoping to do is to reclaim the worldview of our ancient Christian ancestors so that we can see the world more clearly. And by doing so, by the return of hierarchy, this is the return of meaning and beauty and love and truth and purpose. And for men in modern society in particular, regaining sort of this meaning and purpose is a really important thing. The question that I heard from a few of you afterwards is, remind me again, why do I need to understand worldviews? Why is this important? And so there's three main reasons, I think. The first is, with the wrong worldview, we can't see the world as it truly is, right? So the world exists in a certain way, and with these wrong worldviews, it gets twisted, we get blinded from reality, and this can cause unnecessary pain. We can have errors, we can make mistakes in the way we treat people, or mistakes in the direction we go, and it's unique, it's individual, so it's for each individual person, this might manifest in different ways. Without a worldview, we lack clarity and confidence. So if you remember that sort of quadrant slide, there was, if you didn't have this clarity and confidence, you were left directionless, aimless, and fearful for not understanding what the goal was and where we're trying to ascend towards. And then lastly, if you can't name your lenses, you can't change them. And this goes for a lot of different things in your life. If you can't name it, you can't change it. If you can't see a problem, label it, identify it, then your ability to sort of reverse engineer it and dismantle it doesn't exist either. And so in order to change something, we have to be able to name it. And if we can't name our lenses, we can't change them, that means that we can't heal, we can't have repentance, we can't have progress or growth. And so that's why worldviews in the first session is such a critical idea. And if you remember, we also use the analogy of these sort of the foundations of understanding, right? So if you're an ancient Christian, you were a universalist, a dualist, a realist, and a communalist. Whereas modern humanity, most of us are relativists and materialists and individualists and nominalists. And this makes it very difficult as a modern person to wrap your head around what Christianity really is. For agnostics, this is the reason why we can't come to a belief. For engaged Christians, this might be why we can't understand certain ancient traditions or things about the ancient church. And so tonight, in session 2, our goal is to do one thing, and that is to knock one of the big blocks completely off of your foundation of understanding. Tonight, we want to embrace the vertical world. We want to destroy relativism and replace it with universalism. We want to give you an understanding that it isn't just a horizontal world, that in fact it's a vertical world. And so by the end of the night, if you can say something like, okay, I believe in the good, then this session will have been successful. And that's exciting because this session is really sort of a pivot point. The vertical world, if we can wrap our mind around the vertical world, this is sort of the key that unlocks the door to the spiritual world. On the other side of the door, things get really exciting. Unfathomable heights of beauty, depths of meaning. But for now, for this moment, we have to stay firmly grounded here on earth. So, as a reminder, and to go a little bit deeper, what is the vertical world? As with anything spiritual, it's extremely complicated, and there are a million different ways to describe it, and none of the ways that you would use to describe it are sufficient or comprehensive in any way whatsoever. And so what you will see me doing, hopefully, in the upcoming sessions is attempting to point in a direction and then hopping on the other side of whatever I'm pointing to and trying to point in the other direction and trying to sort of triangulate what it is that we're trying to define. I'm going to avoid, hopefully increasingly, as we get further along, it's going to get less philosophical and earthly and more theological and spiritual, and as a consequence, my language is going to get less definitive and sort of more open-ended, and because we're trying to grasp something that is ungraspable. So there's some different ways to describe this difference between flatland that we're used to, the subjective world, versus the vertical world. It is the world of matter versus the world of what matters. Everything's flat and relative versus a hierarchy. Meaninglessness versus meaning. Subjectivity versus objectivity. I'm making documentation of everything that is, everything that exists, versus ought, right? Remember, an is can't tell us an ought. We can't know things about the world and have that inform how we ought to operate in the world. The mundane and everyday versus the transcendent. Chaos versus order, multiplicity, potential versus fulfillment, multiplicity versus unity, love and mercy, truth and holiness. That all of these are all flawed in their own ways as well. So some of these I wouldn't always put into these categories. And so anyway, what I'm trying to get across here is this is complicated, it's deep, and we're just going to be touching the surface. But these are some of the terms that should sort of point you in the right direction. And as a reminder, postmodernism instead, the mistake that postmodernism made, responding to legitimate tyranny in the world, oppression, was to say, well, all this stuff is because you're claiming that you know the truth and you're trying to hold us all to it. And so what they did is they threw out all spiritual claims altogether. And the problem is that flattened the entire world, put us on this trajectory where nothing matters. Everything that is transcendent, everything that is spiritual, things like human rights, goodness, morality, love, honor, responsibility, truth, all these things had to definitionally go out the window. And I think it's obvious why that is a flawed concept. And so I want to give us a new tool today. We've had the horizontal line, we had the vertical line, and as an alternative to postmodernism, which isn't all wrong. It got a few things right. Hierarchies can in fact be oppressive, and only God's hierarchy is not only a perfect hierarchy, only an ideal hierarchy that takes everything into account in the world could possibly be not oppressive. But also that there are multiple ways to the summit, right? And so this isn't, like we said in the first session, this is going to be a apolitical event, and there are, you could associate this with the right hand and the left hand, right of politics and the left of politics. It's not that one side is right and the other is wrong. It's that there's something transcendent above and beyond each of these different paths, right? So each one contains an element of truth, and only by traversing upward can we approach something closer to the truth, rather than our political attempts to enact it. So this is the holy mountain, and what we're attempting to do here is to bring together the horizontal world of subjectivity, which has value and importance, and the vertical world of objectivity, which has value and importance, and to bring them together in a way that is more explanatory, that helps us understand the way the world works more deeply. And so you might have noticed when we were back on this slide that some of these sort of play off of or complete each other. So potential and fulfillment, for instance. These things are highly associated, highly correlated, and one without the other doesn't make any sense. And so while you might have got the sense in the first session that one is good and one is bad, it's not quite that simple. And so then at the top of this mountain, we're putting these transcendental categories that we've been talking about so much. This is the spiritual world. This is where we're headed. And in the upcoming sessions, we're going to learn a lot more about what these things actually are, how they relate to God, how they relate to heaven, how they relate to everything in the spiritual world. And so just to look at this one more way before we move on, there's sort of the prideful claim that somebody might say, well, you should submit to my truth. But then there's the postmodern claim, which there is no truth. And what we're trying to do, the ancient Christian perspective is, there is an objective truth. We don't fully know it, and yet we're striving toward it together. Right? And so this is a really pragmatic slide here. It's just telling you, a wise way that you can go through your everyday interactions. People's pushback on anything associated with objective reality and truth is going to be, hey, you're being mean to me, you're being oppressive. But if you can chart this balancing act, if you can say, look, I'm seeking the truth, I want you to seek the truth with me, and together maybe we can learn from each other and move forward and upward. This is a really simple tool that I use in my own household with my eldest daughter, Nora, when I'm trying to introduce like complicated topics. It might be politics or not. This is an example of 3 of them I did on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it would be really easy as somebody on the left to just say these are the best thing in the world, and be really easy as somebody on the right to say these things are crazy evil and hugely problematic. But through an ancient Christian wisdom type lens, we're trying to say, well, each of these contain elements of the truth, right? And so I'm balancing diversity, equity, inclusion here with unity, justice, and discernment. And there could be other ways of doing this, of course, but I have at the top of the mountain here, beauty or truth. You could also put up here. And so this is whenever Nora and I are, when we see something going wrong or somebody's making a political statement or something like that, we'll kind of do like this little hidden like triangle motion to each other. And that's our signal, our little inside joke to try and remember and think, hey, they're not seeing the whole picture here. There's probably a more beautiful version of this. And so that's really just a pragmatic tool that I've found useful and thought you guys might want to pick up on as well. Okay, so how do we know that the vertical world is true? In this presentation, I'm gonna make 4 arguments as to how we can know the vertical world is true. The first is that it's inescapably human, and then that it's pragmatically true. If you just live this way, it'll be true. And it's core to our existence, and that the alternative is horrifying. I thought I'd start with just a brief story, so a story from the business. When Jessica and I started our university, it wasn't a university at first. It was just a learning company. And in this learning company, we developed lots of different online classes, and there was articles and conferences that people could go to. And but one thing we could never do was to provide degree programs, to full degrees to our students and customers. And so we had been in the business for probably 5 or 6 years, and things were finally starting to go pretty well. There was actually some profit coming off the business, and we were sitting in a really healthy spot. And at that point, we sort of realized that we had this big decision to make. Were we going to pursue getting accredited as an institution, or were we going to just stay here where things were safe and healthy and strong and all that? And so I remember sitting around the table and just saying, like, do you guys really want to do this? This is going to hurt. This is going to be painful. It's going to be 4 or 5 years before we get back to this spot that we're at today, which is comfort and profitability in this case. And so, but we all made the decision that, look, we have this mission that we're going for. We're trying to educate these people, and without this university, we can't fulfill our mission. And so we decided at that point to do it, and I think if we had known how difficult it was going to be, we never would have done it. It was a crazy experience. Just for some context, in the state of Iowa, where we're all at, it's effectively illegal to start a college. They have basically a chicken and egg scenario where it says, well, to become a college in the state of Iowa, you have to be fully accredited. Well, if you go to the accreditors, they say, well, to be accredited, you have to be a college for a certain amount of time. So I won't get into the politics as to why that scenario exists, but it exists. And so there was all sorts of these obstacles that we had to get through. And one of the biggest challenge was that to become accredited, you had to have these, you had to have all these expenses that you wouldn't otherwise have, right? So in order to be a college, you need to have a chief curriculum officer and chief academic officer and all these roles. But we weren't a college, we weren't offering degrees yet, so we had none of the revenue from this new university, but we had all the expenses from this new university. And so this put the whole business model on kilter, tilted us over. And so anyway, it got worse and worse and worse, and we were finally to the point where we were going to get accredited, and we had checked all the boxes, we met all the criteria, and we had loaned just enough money to get through this one last month, at which point we knew the accreditation was going to come in and we were going to start being able to offer our degree program. And when we got the letter from the accreditor, we had passed 199 out of the 200 criteria. And there was one criteria that we didn't meet, and they demanded perfection. There was no, well, you're close enough, go ahead. And so they said, we'll see you again in 6 months, where we'll review it again. And this review process was like tens of thousands of dollars just to put. You had to fly all these employees in anyway. And so the next, a couple months later, I have to make payroll, and we're out of money. And the bank's like, "What do you mean you got delayed 6 months?" And it was to the point where Jessica and I were pulling things off the shelves, pulling things out of the safe, selling them to local people, raising as much cash as we could, and then putting it into the ATM, $1 bill, or one bill at a time. And I remember the night we did it. It was like super windy. It was dark and windy, and there was bills flowing around that we had dropped and flying around that we had dropped, and we could only deposit it like $9,000 at a time. Otherwise, we would have triggered some IRS whatever. And so I tell this story not to pat myself on the back at all. That the point of this story is that when we're striving towards something higher than ourselves, when you're trying to fulfill this mission, when you've got employees you're trying to pay for, when you've got a family you're trying to feed, we'll all do some really weird things that we wouldn't normally do and push things further than we normally would. And there's something about that pattern that's incredibly redeeming and beneficial to society, and we're going to get into that tonight. Joseph Campbell, I think it was back in 1949, wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, Joseph identified a pattern. And this pattern you would know today as the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is basically he found the same pattern in hundreds of different stories, probably thousands of different stories, books, etc., where humans were telling the same story over and over again, just with different characters, different settings, different environments. And you would know a lot of these. This is a series of slides here which applies the hero's journey to a lot of movies that you would recognize. So the hero's journey starts in the ordinary world where the character is really comfortable at home, and you can apply this back to the story that I just told as well as we go. It's Luke Skywalker on the moisture farm in Tatooine. It's Harry Potter and living under the cupboard. And then it goes to the call to adventure. They get asked out. They get said, okay, it's time to leave your comfortable home and go on this grand adventure. For us, it was getting accredited. This is Neo receiving the cryptic message in the Matrix. And then they sort of cross the threshold, like they fight it at first, like, oh, we don't want to do it. Are you sure you want to do this? I don't want to do it. Okay, we're going to do it. Where you jump in. This is Neo taking the red pill, or the Fellowship setting off on their journey to Mount Doom. And on this journey, they face different tests and enemies. I was telling you about the regulatory hurdles that we faced. This is Harry adjusting to life at Hogwarts, I guess, here for the Harry Potter series. And then there's the main ordeal, right? So there's all these little problems, but then you get to the big ordeal. For us, it was the accreditation. For Simba, it's having to fight for the kingdom, Pride Rock there at the end of the movie. And then there's the reward. So there's the AOEU, for instance, is probably 10 times bigger than it was at that time in terms of the size of the company. And for these characters, it's Simba taking over Pride Rock again, or Luke listening to Obi-Wan's advice and using the Force to help him destroy the Death Star. And then the last part of the story is that the hero sort of returns home with the elixir, right? So in my case, it might be that I had some wealth that I could hopefully use for good purposes. For Simba, it's having the Pride Rock and reclaiming his throne. And so the whole idea is that you're bringing back whatever it is that you earned or got or learned. It could be information that you learned or wisdom that you acquired, and you're bringing that back to the original home so that you can improve where it is that you left from. And I think at first my thought was, well, this is a cute pattern that was discovered that he identified things that humans like. But in this quote from George Orwell, I think there's a bigger claim being made here. The best books are those that tell you what you already know. They are books that reveal to you what you yourself think but have not yet articulated. They are the map you follow, the flashlight in the dark that enables you to know yourself. A similar quote here regarding The Lord of the Rings. The characters in Tolkien's world are timeless because they illustrate the eternal themes of virtue and vice, bravery and cowardice, wisdom and foolishness. It's a world of stark moral choices, and in that way it reflects the human condition. Every age needs to hear this message. Okay, so I think what to take away from this is that the reason that The Lord of the Rings is popular today, was popular 50 years ago, and will be popular 500 years from now is not that it's a cute story that humans happen to like. It's that there's some truth built into the story that reflects not only human nature, but patterns of reality. So there's something about adventure, about these heroes' journeys, that can tell us about who we are, what we're supposed to do, and what this reality is. And once I had that thought in my head, and you start to go back and like, what are all the popular works through history? What are the things that are timeless? What are the things that 100 years from now people will still be reading? And then you try to read back into that. What does that say about me? What does that say about my family and my community and humanity in general? It's a really eye-opening mindset. And so I think the conclusion that I draw from the hero's journey being so reflective is that reality is hierarchical. This isn't just something that we like to hear. This is the way the world is. We are meant to climb and destined to fall, but that's another story once we get deeper into the Bible here. But this pattern is ancient. This pattern is everywhere. It's the scripture is flush with it. I'd like, Pastor Stephen, if you'd be willing, if you could talk about this just briefly. I've highlighted on the slides here 7 different stories from scripture, but there's many more. Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how you see this this pattern carried throughout scripture.
So Derek had sent this to me a couple days earlier, and this morning I got a chance to finally look over everything. And the first image that came to my mind is the story of Jacob. So some of you guys will know the story of Jacob and remember it, but Jacob was a twin born with his brother Esau. And Esau comes out first, but Jacob's grabbing a hold of Esau's heel. And his name means deceiver, Jacob's name. So basically his mom saw him and said, well, he's trying to pull his brother back in so he can be the first, and take the birthright. And so from the very beginning of Jacob's story, he's trying to steal Esau's birthright. He's an absolute loser in Scripture, completely. He's a monster of a guy, to be honest with you. His whole life is side-noted by lies and deception to his dad, to his brother, steals his brother's birthright, steals his brother's blessing. He's just he's a mess of a guy. But the story changes as he actually goes on this hero's journey, it's pretty remarkable. And I don't know if have you ever heard the term Jacob's ladder? Okay, so the story of Jacob's ladder, he's on his way to his mom's brother, his uncle, to marry somebody within the family line. And as he's on this journey, he takes a nap, pulls a rock underneath his head, it says, so that he uses the rock as a pillow. And he has a dream. And in the dream, there's a ladder that comes down from the heavens. And ascending and descending are all these heavenly beings going up and down. And at the top of this ladder is the triune God, Yahweh. And he speaks to Jacob. And he tells him that I'm going to give you the land that I promised to your grandfather, Abraham. I'm going to give this all to you. And your purpose, your mission, is to take and possess, and then within that land, it needs to reflect this heavenly kingdom. So what you see up here, I want you to bring down to this plane, this earth. And then Jacob goes, and he's doing his thing, and he runs into his uncle Laban, and he's trying to get married, and he meets a guy that's worse than he is. Like Laban is a huckster of all hucksters. He's a used car salesman on steroids is what he is. And so Jacob is seeing his mirror reflection when he's living with Laban and trying to work towards his wife. He gets sold a wife. He works for his first wife. He thought it was going to be this beautiful girl named Rachel, the youngest sister. And instead, he wakes up in the morning and it's the cross-eyed version named Leah. And he's not too pleased. And then Laban says, well, if you work for me another 7 years, I'll let you have the youngest daughter too. So he has to work 14 years for this guy. And then longer and longer. And finally, he's able to get away. And when he's able to get away, things in Jacob have begun to change. Like he began to see who he was in Laban. And as he's traveling, he finally leaves Laban. He's got this huge caravan of people with him. He's accumulated wealth upon wealth upon wealth. And then he hears his brother Esau is coming to meet him. And the last time he heard from Esau was Esau swearing his death. Esau, his brother, wants to kill him. And that's all he knows. And so he separates his family. And that night, the scripture gives us 3 images. It says, first off, he wrestled with a man. And then it says he wrestled with the angel of the Lord. And then the book of Hosea tells us he wrestled with God. So he wrestled with one who looked like a man, who was God, who gave him a message like an angel. Right? That's what's going on. And as he's wrestling all night long, and the Hebrew word for wrestling here is rolling in dirt, is the actual word for it. And so they're rolling around for hours upon hours. And Jacob won't let go of him, and the angel of the Lord won't let go of Jacob. And it at the very end, daylight's coming, and the angel of the Lord says, you need to let me go. And so Jacob says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And so the blessing, which is the pinnacle, if you will, the angel of the Lord touches him in the hip, and his hip goes out of joint, which lets us know that the angel could win this thing at any time. And immediately his hip goes out of joint. And then the angel of the Lord says, you're no longer Jacob. Your identity is no longer deception. You're not a deceiver anymore. Now you're going to be known as Israel. And the word Israel is a really interesting word. The Hebrew word means he retains God. So if you could actually say it this way, he has become a receptacle in which God can be received and retained. That's what Israel means. And from that point, the story of Scripture tells us that Jacob always walked with a limp. His hip never went back into place. It was never healed fully, functionally. So he carried the mark of who he was and who he has become for the rest of his life. And this is this perfect hero's journey. There's even, this death and resurrection aspect. His old identity dies, his new identity comes to life. And that identity is not, it's interesting. It's not about wealth or power per se. It's about possessing land and then implementing what he saw in the heavens in that land. It's about transformation. So he's given this brand new vision and mission and purpose to life that he didn't have beforehand. Beforehand, all he had was, I want the birthright, and I'll do whatever it takes to get the birthright. He was self-centered, inward-focused. He was completely turned inward. And now he's had this resurrection journey, if you will, where part of him completely dies off and something is reborn in him. Identity completely changes. And that's the story of Israel. We don't even get Jesus without this story taking place. So to me, it's a pretty phenomenal story in the sense that it fits this adventure in Scripture. It fits this theme completely and fully.
That's great. And I could tell that story contains, we'll have to circle back to that story as we gain additional tools, because things like being a vessel for God, things like making the land reflect the heavens, these are things that we're going to unlock and understand at a deeper level as the sessions go on. So that's exciting. Thank you, Pastor. Yep.
Just a little bit from that too, at least. I remember last session that you told us that we should interrupt if we can.
Yes, please.
Just at the end, the first vision that God gave him of the ladder, saying that you need to possess the land and then make everything in that. That's exactly what the heavenly mountain that you're telling us is, because it's looking vertical and then trying to make looking horizontal, then trying to make that into what's vertical.
That's exactly right. So so now you're catching on to the fulfillment or potential and fulfillment pattern that we identified with those lines earlier. That's exactly right. What I'd like to do is to say, okay, so we've introduced the idea of hierarchy. We've introduced the idea of these transcendental categories like truth and beauty and love and goodness. We're going to finish this later in the presentation, but what I want you to do, just take 2 minutes, 2-3 minutes, and for each of these are all aspects of your life, dimensions of your life. Just with one sentence or less, write in the square box there sort of what your status quo is, right? Here's where I'm at. And later on, we're going to talk about the heights and depths that are on either side of that, but just sort of lay out where it is that you feel like you're at today. And what I should say is as well that it would be entirely normal for all of us to have at least one of these categories that is a complete disaster, right? I know I have at least one of these categories. It's a complete disaster. And so don't feel like you have to be knocking each one of these out of the ballpark, especially when you're younger. These are, less fulfilled than they will be as you get older. So this could be things that you might fill in here. Family, you might be like, you know what, I'm not spending enough time with my kids. But we do have this thing we do every Friday night, and that's good. Or with your health, you might be like, I don't run, I don't work out. These are the types of things you can fill it with. Or just, what's the status quo? Nothing like trying to map your entire life in 3 minutes, right? Okay, so as we go through the session today, I just want you to think about, when we get to the end, I'm going to have you look at this sheet again, and we're going to try and label what would be the highest possible thing you could imagine achieving in this area of your life, and the lowest possible thing that you could achieve. What if it all fell apart, what would that look like? And as we go through the presentation, I'm going to, hopefully you'll pick up on categories of what would make one of these things good or what would make one of these things bad, because the way you might label it today as the ultimate highest thing might look a little bit different by the time we're done. A couple questions here that I think are really interesting, potentially in particular to anybody who's agnostic or unengaged Christian. Why is it that all humans seek the transcendent? Which is really sort of what an adventure is, right? The adventure is saying, well, here's where I am, but I know there's something better. I know there's something that's great that's out there. And why do humans seek that if it doesn't exist? Are there any other animals that seek things that don't exist? Why would that be? Why is it that humans are the only creatures that can seemingly fail to live up to their station in life, right? We can have this sense that it's like, well, I'm not doing as well as I could be. I'm not accomplishing what I could accomplish. I'm not utilizing my God-given talents, or I'm not doing the good that I should be doing. This doesn't exist with other creatures. Why is it that it exists with humans? This quote from Mark Twain I really like: man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. We have this sense that there's this standard by which we're all being measured. And yet nobody can see it or taste it or touch it or smell it. But the standard seems to exist nonetheless. Okay, so that's the argument that the vertical world is inescapably human. It's built in. The stories that we're telling over and over again imply a vertical reality. And this is true throughout time. The next argument here is that the vertical world is pragmatically true. Has anybody here read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning by chance? This is a absolutely wonderful book. I highly recommend it for everyone. Viktor Frankl is a psychologist, and he went through the Holocaust. So he was at Dachau. I can't remember what other famous. He was at several of the big. What are they called? Concentration camps. And the book starts with just story of suffering. In the first chapter, he tells a story of arriving at Dachau, and there's a German soldier standing at the front of the line with his arms crossed, analyzing each person that got to the front of the line, and he either pointed right or he pointed left, and they had no idea what was the theme, what was the standard by which they were being measured. But one line went to the ovens, and the other line went to the workhouses. And it was that simple, just one man pointing in one direction. And when Victor was taken, they took a manuscript that he had been working on. He had been working on this paper, and this gave him a tremendous amount of motivation to survive. He felt like this paper had some value to humanity, and he really wanted to get it published. And so this turned into this desire to survive, so that he could do this really important thing. And while he was in the camps, people were dying all around him, and he began to notice a pattern of what why people survived. There were certain people that were surviving. There were certain things in common with the people who lived, and that the people who died didn't have. And it basically boiled down to some people had faith. They had either religious faith or a belief that they were going to be saved. Maybe they read in some newspaper that the Americans were going to come on this particular date. And when that date came and they didn't get saved, they would smoke their last cigarette the next day and die in their sleep. It was like their heart had broken and just given out. And then there were certain people that stayed alive because they had a belief that a loved one was alive and was in the adjacent camp. And then they'd find out that their wife had died, and they'd smoke their last cigarette that last night and die in their sleep. And for other people, it was their purpose. It was, I'm staying alive so that I can take care of so-and-so. Or I'm staying alive so that I can publish my book. Or I'm staying alive so that I can take care of this thing when I'm done. I have this job to do, and no matter how much I suffer, I'm going to make sure it gets done. And for some of those people, for instance, if they had a purpose of, I'm taking care of so-and-so because they're in worse shape than I am. And then if the person that they were taking care of died, they would die the next day. And so what Victor concluded from his experience was that we think of survival as merely this physical reality, just, do you have enough calories? Do you, but in reality, the mind and the heart are at work. And so he concluded that faith, love, and purpose are the sort of the things that humanity truly needs. The things that truly keep us alive. And this, for him, implied that this is sort of the core of reality. This is the rock bottom truth of what humanity actually is and what we truly need to live. One of the things I found interesting in this book is that some of the prisoners even found their meaning in suffering itself, because they wanted to suffer well. They wanted to suffer with dignity. They didn't want to be the one crying and screaming or whatever. They wanted to be strong because they perceived that as a good. And then they also polled thousands of the survivors after the Holocaust, and a majority said that they believed the experience was formative and they didn't regret it. This blew my mind. Can you imagine coming out of those camps and being like, that was, and I think it was several years after they exited the camps, probably right when they got out of it, they probably would have had different numbers, but after, they had 5 or 10 years to reflect on it, they said that it was an important formative part of their life. So definitely read that book. His accounts are just beautiful. And then Fyodor Dostoevsky, he had a similar experience on the Russian side. He was thrown into similar types of conditions. And what I find interesting, he wrote The Brothers Karamazov, and if you read this book, you will come away seeing the exact same patterns that are in Viktor Frankl, his claims as to what's actually most important to humanity, what humanity actually needs. Again, faith, love, and purpose. One of my favorite quotes from Frankl's book is that in some ways suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning. And so I created this graphic here on the left which shows human potential there in the middle, humans and just sort of our status quo. And then it shows, like, in order to climb, you have to have this purpose and meaning. To me, like, the love and the faith, all of those you could still sort of distill down into purpose. It's basically this directionality. It's this belief that there's something higher that I'm suffering for, that I'm dying for. And so I'm summarizing it here by just saying purpose and meaning. And so purpose and meaning is basically the only thing that can justify that suffering. If you can say, look, I'm suffering for a purpose, I'm suffering for love, I'm suffering for something beyond myself, all of a sudden you can transform that suffering into something higher. The alternative, without this purpose and meaning, is just aimless entropy. It's even if you're not deciding to go down, even if you're not saying I'm just going to give up, if you're trying to just maintain the status quo, essentially this entropy pulls you downward, pulls you into nihilism, pulls you into despair. And the claim of the people who've been through these hard times is that once you get to despair, that's death. That's where it inevitably leads. And so not only is this sort of pragmatically true, like, you know, if you live your life in this more meaningful way, if you're pursuing things that are higher than yourself, not only does that insulate you from some of the harms and dangers that are in the world, but it also points to a hidden reality that exists. This entropy, people have asked me about this entropy a lot, like why entropy? And I guess I chose that word because this is something that's sort of like inevitable in science. You know, you have sort of like the things tend to fall apart, steel just rusts. If nobody's holding it together, if nobody's maintaining it, machines fall apart. The whole universe is falling apart at all times. And so this entropy, I think, is a word that helps us sort of wrap our head around, you know, if you decide you're just going to stand still, I'm going to stand still, I'm not going to climb, I'm not going to pursue anything, I'm just going to be. The problem with just being is that you're standing in quicksand. You're standing in spiritual quicksand. And the consequence of just standing still means that you are falling. You're being pulled down. And so without this proactive decision to climb, we sort of naturally end up falling. I wanted to recommend tonight, I'm going to show a couple Peterson clips. Dr. Jordan Peterson is sort of the person in the modern day and age who's popularizing this story. You guys may have seen some of his videos out there. Some of Peterson's stuff gets kind of political and all that, but the stuff that I would recommend is his biblical series. He did, 7 lectures here? I think there might be one more, but at least 7 different lectures on the Bible. And what he does is he takes his experience in psychology, and he identifies the same patterns that he sees in his clients back to scriptural wisdom, and he'll identify human patterns that are true throughout the ages. So this is free on YouTube. You can watch it, and I found it highly entertaining and informational. I'm going to try and play a couple quotes here, so hopefully these transitions work fairly smoothly.
Wake up. We have a moral burden to bear, and that's the adventure of our life. That's the other thing. So interesting about the Abrahamic story is that God calls Abraham out of his luxurious slumber and sends him into a catastrophe. Tyranny, starvation, war, brutal. But he has the adventure of his life. You might say, well, it's the adventure of your life that justifies the catastrophe of your life. It's not some simple-minded, juvenile hedonism or desire for comfort. That's not what we're built for. We're built for the adventure of our lives. And where do you find that? You find that in orienting yourself to the highest possible good in all ways and speaking the truth forthrightly along that pathway.
So yeah, Jordan finds the same pattern that some of our other authors did in his psychological analysis, in his biblical studies, connecting the same dots, coming to the same conclusions that humanity is built for this process of pursuing the good, the true, the beautiful. I think Jordan can sometimes turn people off because he's using such high-minded language that it sometimes seems disconnected from our everyday reality. This little clip of Jordan, though, I think makes the other case.
One of the chapters in my books is focused on putting your house in order. It's like, well, how do you start? Make your bed. Look around and see what bugs you in your room. Just look. It's like, okay, I'm in my room. Do I like this room? No, it bugs me. Okay, why? Well, the paint's peeling there, and it's dusty there, and the carpet's dirty, and that corner's kind of ugly, and the light there isn't very good, and my clothes closet's a mess, so I don't even like to open it. Okay, that's a lot of problems. That's a lot of opportunity. Pick something and fix it. Pick a problem. Pick a solution to it that you know would help, that you could do, that you would do. I've been in here for 10 years and I've never cleaned it up. It's like, well, obviously that's too big a dragon for you. Would you clean one drawer? Find out.
So yeah, I mean, when we're sitting here, we're talking about going on an adventure and slaying dragons and, Lord of the Rings and all this kind of stuff, and you're just like, this is too epic for me, right? But the truisms that are found in these stories are true all the way down, right? To the biggest parts of your life and the smallest parts of your life. And so it doesn't have to be that you're conquering the world or becoming the president or slaying a dragon or something like that. Spiritual progress can sometimes seem materially small, right? Little, huge leaps towards love or truth or goodness might look like a small smile in the material world, right? Or a helping hand. And so it's not that none of this applies to us, it's just that we have to be able to bring it down to our own level, right? Some of the greatest things that you'll do in your life might just be taking care of your own kid or taking, somebody, a neighbor across the street. I think a really good evidence of this in Scripture is Mark 12. Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury. And many were rich and put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrans. And this is like pennies, basically. So he called his disciples to him and said to them, "Assuredly I say to you, that this poor widow has put in more than all of those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she put in out of her poverty, put in all that she had, her whole livelihood." And so I think we can all get kind of intimidated, these like heroic adventures and stuff like that. It's like they're cool and they're interesting, but applying it to our own lives, it seems sometimes it can be disconnected. And so the thing I would say is, if you imagine the mountain as, God at the top and you at the bottom, and your progress up is sort of your virtue, right? It's not as important your height up the mountain or the size of your sacrifice. What's most important is your stance towards God, your stance towards what's highest. Are you pursuing the ultimate good, or are you distracted and pursuing something earthly? Are you pursuing beauty and truth and goodness? And when I say beauty, by the way, I'm not talking about aesthetics. I'm talking about the way things should be, God's holy order, everything in its perfect place. You with your talents doing the perfect thing that you're supposed to do. That's beauty. And so it's not about your height to the mountain necessarily, but rather the attention and love where your gaze is focused. And maybe the most important thing is our modern world tells us to look inward. And in ancient Christianity, this is pride. This is looking inward and saying, what do I want? What can I get? What would be best for me? This is looking inward, and what the mountain is telling us, what Christianity is telling us, is that we're supposed to be looking outward and upward. We're supposed to be helping others and pursuing the ultimate good. One thing that I think Jordan brings to the table that not a lot of other people have is that he points out that everybody has a purpose. Everybody has meaning in their life. And it's just a matter of if their purpose is good or bad or noble or unworthy, right? So we all have this hierarchy of meaning. And for some people, they've got all the wrong things at the top, right? We're all tempted to this. I have money at the top. I have sex at the top. I have food at the top. I have whatever it is, right? And in a way, the way of looking at the thing that's at the top of your hierarchy is that you're worshiping those things, right? If sex is all you think about, you worship sex. If you have lust. If money's all you think about, then you're making money your God, And that's a problem. This quote here, Russell Brand.
When it says in the Old Testament, worship no other gods than me, the implication I offer is that we are a species that worships, and if you do not access the divine, you will worship the mundial, you will worship the profane, you will worship your own identity, you will worship your belongings, you will worship the template laid before you by a culture that but gets you distracted and relatively dumb.
I think we can all relate to that, right? Like, we're all pursuing mountain peaks different from the highest possible peak at different points in our lives. And part of this is natural and inevitable, but it's always something that we can transcend and go beyond. And so you and everybody you know is worshiping something, is putting something at the top of their priority list. And it's not always the thing that should be at the top of our priority list. And so what happens when that happens?
You have to take ultimate responsibility. Failure to act, often that's the most catastrophic. To not do the right thing when the situation presents itself. You could do the right thing if you were willing to take a risk of relatively moderate size, and you know that you could take the risk, and you know that you should take the risk, and you don't. And that happens to people all the time. And then what happens is the thing that they didn't oppose grows a little bit, and they shrink a little bit, and that starts a loop.
Some of these dots we will connect a little bit later when we get to the spiritual world, but yeah, that's I've just seen this so many times in my life. You know, the thing that you ignore, the thing you don't give attention to, that problem rarely goes away, right? It gets bigger, and you regret not addressing it when it was a smaller issue. Genesis 4:7, if you, Cain, do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So this is a pattern here where we're saying, if you offer the right sacrifice, you will be accepted. Good things will happen. You will be more connected to these spiritual truths. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. The implication here is that it's going to be cascadingly worse, right? Small problems, small things that you let to get worse are going to get worse and worse and worse and eventually tackle you from behind. And so don't let it tackle you from behind. You must rule over it, right? You have to confront it forthrightly. You have to face with it, and that's the only way out. The only way out is through. So the Jordan Peterson stuff, I think, you know, the big thing that Jordan brings to the table, and I would say he's not a Christian. He's not fully, he's like the most Christian non-Christian I've ever met. He understands it at a level so much deeper than almost any Christian, but he can't get over a few really critical hurdles. And so, but I think what he demonstrates better than anybody, and along the lines of some of these greats like Frankl and Dostoevsky, is that living in the vertical world, living with the assumption that there is good and bad and right and wrong, is the only way to go through the world. The people who aren't even asking these questions, who are just doing what they want to do, that will, you know, bite them eventually. The next argument I'm going to make here is that the vertical world is core reality. And this is the most complicated part of it. This is the part that might seem a little intimidating or philosophically deep, but I think it's interesting nonetheless.
To move forward towards something is simultaneously to value it. And so one of the implications of that is that we always live in a framework of value. There's no escaping that, and that we're moved forward. I detailed this out quite substantially in my book, Maps of Meaning, but we're always at a place, and we're always moving towards a place that in principle has some advantage over the place we're at. Otherwise, why move towards it? And so what that means is that there's no life without value. At least there's no human life without value. Out of necessity. And also, not only out of necessity at the physiological level, but also out of necessity at the psychological level. Because another thing that you might point out, that I think is usefully pointed out, is that not only do you have to move from point A to B in life, but point A is often a very difficult place to be, because we're fragile and bounded and mortal and limited, and because we know that.
Okay, so what the heck did that mean? So again, the case that we're trying to make here is that the vertical world is core reality. And what Jordan said here is that in order to even perceive the world, in order to see and understand what's around you, you have to have a hierarchy. So in this room, there is an infinite amount of detail. You could look at the lights, you could look at the couch, you could look at the chairs, you could look at the wood, you could look at the steel, you could look at... And then each one of those things that you could look at, you could break it down into pieces, right? This table has legs, this table has a top, this top has 10 pieces of wood, there's a drawer, and each one of those 10 pieces of wood has made up of grains, and you can analyze the grains, and we could get the microscope out, and we could look at the cells and break it up into more and more pieces. So your entire life could be spent in this room just better understanding the room. And yet that would be a horrible way to exist, right? So instead what we do is we focus on almost nothing at all. We focus on just a couple things. You're all focused on me. And this act of focusing is like relevance realization. It's identifying the one thing out of all the things that is actually important. And so the argument that he's making here is that this hierarchy is inevitable. It's core to just existing as a human. It's sort of ground truth. And what he says is the world isn't made of objects, it's made of meaning, right? So that table, I don't describe by this infinite series of details on what the wood is and all that kind of stuff. I say it's a table. And it's a table because that's its meaning, that's its purpose. That's how it relates to me, that's how it relates to you, and everything that matters. And so it's really complicated. I still can't wrap my head completely around it, but what it means to me is that this hierarchy, this vertical world, is inescapable, unavoidable, inevitable, and always. It's something that's core to reality and core to your humanity. This is the same thing said in different words. New character here, his name is Jonathan Peugeot. We'll be seeing a lot more of him in the next session.
The fact that the world lays itself out as ordered, as patterned, inevitably, that there is no way around it. You cannot avoid the order of the world because in order for you to even perceive anything, it has to have an identity, it has to have a hierarchy, has to have a margin, has to have all these things. It's all there in every
act of perception.
Exactly. And so in every act of perception. And so it's that.
So every act of perception presumes a value hierarchy.
Exactly. You can't avoid it. And so it's not like an act of faith in the sense that I at the outset think the world is nihilistic and chaotic. It's like, no, I don't. I think that on the contrary, I think that you could say it in a religious way, that the love of God holds the world together, and it's inevitable that things are held together by these patterns of being that are always aiming towards the good, even in the very identity of whatever it is that you're encountering.
So we'll get a little deeper into this in the next session. For now, all I want to accomplish here is to point to the fact that if you're trying to understand the way reality works, the way humans interact with that reality, perception is at the core, and hierarchy is at the core of this perception. And so in the next session, we'll sort of lay out where these things are and what the map actually looks like, this new ancient cosmology. But the point here is just that it's unavoidable and inevitable. And you see this pattern again in Scripture. This is sort of like this is like a really cosmic verse where it's trying to lay out like this is the way the world works. I have set before you life and death, vertical, right? Life at the top, death at the bottom, blessings and curses. Now choose life that you and your children may live. And then there's a way that seems right to man, down, but in the end is the way of death, right? We all just want to live in our subjective worlds. We all just want to live in our material worlds. I want to pursue the material things. I just want the money and the sex and the drugs and the food and everything else. But that pursuit is the way of death. The second claim here, that is sort of core reality. Again, we're trying to evidence, we're trying to prove that the vertical world is core reality, is suffering. So every person suffers, every person dies, even our loved ones. And what a frightening thought that is. And what society tells us is that we should pursue happiness. And the problem with pursuing happiness is essentially hedonism, is that you will inevitably not be happy. There will be a time where there is no happiness to be acquired. Anybody here who's ever been miserably sick knows exactly what I'm talking about. What is that saying, Elijah? There's, I think you told me this. The sick man, or the well man wants an infinite number of things. The sick man just wants one thing, just wants to be healthy again, right? And so this pursuit of happiness is really hollow, because there will be times where happiness is unachievable. And even now, if I tell you, be happy, go, you can't do it. But if I tell you, do something meaningful, do something purposeful, well, you and I can start making a plan on how to do that right now, right? So happiness is something that's out of your control. Happiness is something that happens as a result of just doing something meaningful with people who are meaningful to you, right?
Jesus taking up his cross is an image that Christ himself uses for us. He says, you have to take up your cross. It's the load that we have, right? It is our own suffering. It is our own obstacles. It is everything that is in our way. The best thing you can do is not complain about it, not whine about it, because it doesn't change anything, but it is to take it and to move forward with the difficulties that are in front of you.
Why did the Romans use the crucifix as a weapon of tyranny? Well, because it's the instrument of maximal torture. Why did God take the cross on as his particular embodied burden? And the answer to that is something like, well, because it's the worst thing that could possibly happen. And so that's the maximal burden that could be borne. Why did that become a divine symbol? Because that which is most divine will guide you best through the worst possible suffering. It's the place where suffering is experienced and transcended.
So the argument that's being made here is that, the deeper the pain, the deeper the suffering requires the divine in the opposite direction, right? Only the highest possible meaning will sort of cover the deepest possible suffering. And so we'll talk about this more in the future, but in ancient Christianity, Christ was seen as the type, and we're the prototype. And so we're supposed to reflect Christ, and we do so already. We're created in the image of God, and what that means is not that we look like God, like we got ears and eyes and nose and all that. What it means to be created in the image of God is that there's something of his character in us. There's some ability of us to reflect God more clearly. And so Christ is the type, we're the prototype. Christ chose to destroy death by death. Likewise, by embracing our own suffering forthrightly and living lives of meaning, we can also transform our suffering into salvation, right? And so, for instance, if one of us jumps in front of a bus to save a little kid from death, you will have died, but saved a kid. You were going to die anyway, right? But now that death is now flipped head over heels, and death and suffering now becomes good. It gets redeemed, right? All of a sudden, that death actually has meaning, has a purpose, and so that's an extreme example. That's where you take this idea to its end, but this applies in much smaller quantities to our everyday lives. This quote from Father John Bear I really like. He said that a human being, so not just a being, is one who lives their life by voluntarily laying down their life for their neighbor, right? So a being is somebody who just lives. That's what it means to be a being. To be is a being is being in the world. A human being, what makes it human is by reflecting God, reflecting Christ on the cross, by voluntarily laying down their life, or laying down the material parts of their life for the spiritual. Another way of looking at this is that sort of have the material world here on the left, and if you read those, you'll see that these are very inward looking, right? I want sex, I want popularity, I want power, I want stability, I want luxury, I want comfort. These would be very common things for people to want. And the claim of Christianity is that humanity is best sacrificing those things on behalf of higher things, right? So I'm willing to give up the stability of just going along to get along in favor of truth, speaking the truth. I'm willing to give up entertainment for doing something with purpose. I'm willing to give up dominating my spouse with power in favor of love. I'm willing to give up food to sacrifice it for other people, whatever it is. And so this move from the material world to the vertical world, to voluntarily give up the things our fallen nature pushes us to desire, and other things, other influences, in favor of what it is that we should be pursuing. And this process actually makes us more human, right? So if you go back to Father Bear's definition of what it means to be a human being, the process of setting aside these worldly desires in favor of these spiritual truths is the process of becoming what you were meant to be, more of a human. In Romans 12, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. One thing I should probably point out here is that you might think, well, this is kind of a bum deal. Like, this doesn't sound like much fun. I have to give up some of these things. I kind of like some of those things. Well, if you're injecting more love into your relationship, it's not that you're going to have to give up on power necessarily, right? So it's not that you have to be a monk or something like that. This pattern, another way of saying this pattern is that, as Mary said, let it be to me according to your word, let it be according to your will. This is effectively the pattern, which is to say, look, I have these things I want to do. Like Mary probably didn't, want to be at risk of being stoned to death for having a child out of wedlock. That was probably a material desire of hers. But let it be according to your word, according to your will. This is the pattern that we're supposed to follow, which is, I would like to do this, but I know I should do that. And setting aside, having sort of these mini deaths to yourself in order to allow the spiritual world to dwell in you. It's hard for me to avoid using some of the language I want to use to describe these things because we're not going to get to some of these until later sessions. This is a really good summarizing verse. For many walk as enemies of the cross of Christ. Their end is destruction, but their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame with minds set on earthly things. And so in this, I underlined the cross. What is the cross? The cross is the pattern that we've been talking about, which is this pattern of sacrifice, this pattern of setting aside what we want for what we ought. And the belly is the opposite of that. The belly is our animal desires, the things that you want naturally, right? So if you're an enemy of the cross, that means you're not going to sacrifice anything. You're inherently selfish. And if you live by the cross, rather than your belly, you're inherently selfless. thinking about the good that you can do in the world rather than just satisfying your carnal desires. And this section here, we end with this big quote from Father Seraphim Rose, brilliant holy man, and this quote's kind of long and deep, but it's really worth it. He says, "Why do men learn through pain and suffering and not through pleasure and happiness? Very simply because pleasure and happiness accustom one to satisfaction with the things given in this world." So when everything's going well, you kind of tend to think you got everything you need, right? Hey, I'm doing okay for myself. Things are going okay. Whereas when we introduce pain and suffering, which are inevitable, it drives one to seek a more profound happiness beyond the limitations of this world. So all of a sudden the world's no longer cutting it. Like, I'm in pain, I'm suffering over here. Things aren't going the way they should. And you start to realize what's true, which is that the physical world isn't enough. That material reality is flawed in some really fundamental ways. Or I should say incomplete, not flawed. It is good. I am at this moment in some pain, and I call on the name of Jesus, not necessarily to relieve the pain, but that Jesus, in whom alone we may transcend the world, may be with me during it, and his will be done in me. Right? So somebody who's in pain, and yet he's thinking about what good I can do with my existence despite this pain. Right? I'm not worried about just making this go away. I'm worried about what it is I can do good despite my condition. But in pleasure, I do not call on him. I am content then with what I have, and I think I need no more. I think there's this extent to which, we bring on too much technology, things get too easy, we have, all the resources that we need, and I think that's the danger in that, is that you lose sight of this spiritual truth. You lose sight of God. You lose sight of the things that are really important. And so sometimes when you're dealing with less, or when you're dealing with suffering or death in the family, things like that, you get reacquainted real quick with these spiritual realities that are otherwise hidden. He continues, "And why is a philosophy of pleasure untenable? Because pleasure is impermanent and unreliable, and pain is inevitable. In pain and suffering, Christ speaks to us, and thus God is kind to give them to us, and yes, allows evil too. For in these we glimpse something of what must lie beyond, if there really exists what our hearts most deeply desire." And so, again, we'll get into this more, but in the beginning, in Adam, when Adam and Eve ate the fruit and sinned, and they were cast out of the garden, and death entered the world, we tend to see this death and this suffering as only negative, as only bad. And it is true that nothing bad comes from God. What comes from God is good. But God can use these things. God can use suffering. God can use death, and to redeem it and towards a positive good. And so death and pain and suffering, these are tools that help us realize that the material world around us isn't all that exists, that there's something higher, something transcendent that we should be pursuing. Okay, last one, and this is the quickest one here. The vertical world. Okay, sorry, just to summarize the core reality one. So we made two arguments there, that we need the vertical world to just perceive the world around us. If we don't have a vertical world, we can't even see and make our way through the day. From the moment you wake up, you have a hierarchy. I have to go pee. I have to turn on the light. Whatever it is, and that carries through to the very end of the day. And then also at the if there's anything that's core to reality, it's death. If there's anything that's core to reality, it's suffering. And the hierarchy has an answer for that as well. So the vertical world is, the alternative is horrifying. This is a really ugly hypothetical, but in order to optimize the survivability of the human race, this is not something I believe, by the way. This is It's important for us to systematically sacrifice the lowest tier of society so that organs can be used and as needed for organ transplants for the highest tier of society. Doing so will enhance the societal progress of long-term human flourishing. Now, is there anything within science or biology or anything like that that would say this is wrong? You know, the material world, the world of science would have no opinions on this. It's like, and yet, I suspect that almost all of you would probably check the top box and say this is objectively wrong. Like, even if all of us had a vote right now and said, oh no, it's good, I could see how this would be beneficial to society long term. If we all voted and we all agreed it was actually okay, let's do that, would it be wrong or would it be right at that point? Does us voting and all agreeing make it right? And so this is the stark contrast between accepting the vertical world and ignoring or dismissing the vertical world. If you dismiss the vertical world, then there is no objective wrong. It's only subjective. It's just my opinion that we shouldn't harvest organs. It's not really a bad thing. It's just I don't like it personally. Right? And so there's this consequence. Without God, there is no good, and without good, there is no God. And so there are things. And so basically, if you check this top box and you say, no, this is objectively wrong, like despite my feelings and others, then what you have established is that there are things in this world that truly exist, yet they're not part of the material world, right? Science has no ability to say, to verify its existence. We can't put in a beaker, we can't test it, we can't run, put in our hypothesis and run different tests on all sides of the world to prove whether it's true or not. It's not of the type. It's beyond the scope of science. It's beyond, science isn't of the nature to prove or disprove the existence of these things, and yet we're all committed to them existing. They must exist. What we've established then, if you believe that objective goodness exists, is that if there is a good, and there is a more good, and a less good, and a most good, and a least good, what we've done is establish this mountain, this pyramid. We've established that there is a highest possible good. And if we're going to name that highest possible good, what could we possibly name it? It would be highly associated with God, right? So there is a most good. There is a good that contains all the other goods and from which all other goods flow. The thing at the top of the hierarchy which defines all the things below the hierarchy, the standard by which we're all measured, and the source of all the things that are good. What could you possibly call that? The same with the truth. There is true, and there's things that are more true, and even more true. But at the we've established that if there's true and more true and less true and least true, that there is a most possible true. And at the top of that truth mountain, again, is God. Finally, on this argument that the alternative is horrifying, I've laid it out in sort of a story. You can accept the story that most people are operating under in modern day on the left, or we can accept the ancient Christian story, which I think is infinitely more beautiful. The first story, the world around you is meaningless, reality is material only, it came into existence out of chance and randomness. You and your loved ones are nothing more than sacks of cellular meat without inherent value. There is no good, there is no bad, there is no beauty, there is no universal truths. Everything is subjective and there is no free will. Thus, your life has no purpose. Right? If you think the world is just material, then free will is just neurons and chemicals firing in your mind. You're just responding to stimuli chemically. You don't get to choose. You're not choosing anything. You just have the perception of choosing. Right? That's what the material world, if you only accept the material world, that's the conclusion that you're left with. There's no free will, therefore there is no purpose to my life. If you do adopt the vertical world, if you say that there is hierarchy, that there is good and bad, then you're left with a much different story, much more beautiful, ancient story. The world around you is imbued with meaning. You and your loved ones are sacred and special. Goodness really exists, and there is a most good. Beauty really exists, and there is a most beautiful. Truth really exists, and there is a most true. Your life has potential, meaning, and purpose, and life is best lived accepting a sacrificial relationship with what's highest. If there is good, then we want to live sacrificing to that most good, to put aside what we would do versus what we should do. Okay, with that is the final argument. If we're accepting the story, then I think the implication is that it's time to take up your cross. I really like this meme here on the right. Every man has a sword to forge, a castle to build, a dragon to slay, a princess to rescue. And again, this sort of casts it into like grandiose themes, right? But a dragon to slay might be something as starting by just cleaning your room tomorrow, moving in the right direction. I wanted to give a couple examples of how you could pragmatically implement some of these ideas in your life. Our family is trying to implement this like family motto: seek the truth, be the good, build the beautiful, so that we can have an excuse to bring these topics up in front of the kids more often and have a common language that we share when we're looking at things in the world. When I was at AWU, the last thing I did as the CEO was implement this adventure culture. And it was my attempt to identify what really matters to people, what really motivates people, basically get down to their humanity itself and say, what is it that they need out of the world? And so if you're an employee, these are the things that, you can translate each one of these into like, benefits at work or whatever they are. You could, if you're an employer, you can look to say, okay, well, this person's unhappy and threatening to leave. Why is that? Well, they don't have purpose, or they're not making an impact, or they don't have ownership and responsibility over something. So this is, I think, a really strong list of things that people would need that reflects a decade or more of my work at AWU. And that brings us back to our little chart here, my vertical life. And so we don't need to fill these out here. You can take this home and sort of flesh it out more, but you can start. And just thinking the themes that we brought up today. So yeah, I'm not, maybe when I came in here and I said, my health could really use some work, and I'd really like to get six-pack abs because I think that'd be cool and the girls would like it. Okay, well, that's a materialistic, inward-looking goal, right? It doesn't mean that's invalid. But there are higher goals that you could set, right? So I want to get healthier. I want my heart to be healthier so that I can live longer for my kids, right? Or I want to get healthier so that I can, the work that I do around the community, helping little old ladies keep their furnaces running, that I can do it without running out of breath, right? And so now there's a reason that I want to get healthier besides some hedonistic material benefit. Right? So how would we organize this differently after hearing some of these thoughts? So try to put at the top, at the very, very top, when you fill these out, what's the highest possible spiritual, what's the highest possible not worldly but transcendent principles version of how I could live my spiritual life, my family life, my health, my community, my career. And then do the opposite. If I was completely selfish and then I didn't make any progress even on my earthly goals, on my material goals, where would that send me? And then once you do that, if you want to take it to the next level, write 3 bullets on how you would accomplish that. Right? So if I want to, reach this health goal so that I can live longer for my kids, what would it take to actually do that? And even more importantly, write out what it would take to get you to the lowest possible one. Because this will sort of give you this sense of like, whoa, not only am I in this imperfect status quo, but I'm on a trajectory for things to get much worse. Recapping the session, the vertical world is key, which unlocks the door to the spiritual world. The vertical world is the world of meaning, of what matters, of what we ought. We know that the vertical world is true because it's inescapably human, pragmatically true, core to existence, and because the alternative is just plain horrifying. And we succeed in the vertical world primarily through the pattern of sacrifice. We sacrifice what we want for what we ought. And with that, we have completed session 2. The next session is on reclaiming the spiritual world. This is where it gets exciting in my mind. This is where we sort of make this big pivot into not just the seen world, but the unseen heavens. Thank you.